Choosing the right dropper may seem like a bit of a minefield. You're going to need a post that fits inside your frame, you might have to buy the lever separately, and getting maximum drop can be a little bit complicated to calculate. But don't worry, I'm going to go over all of those things and more in this video, so stick with me to work out how to get the best dropper post for your bike. Before I explain everything you need to know before buying a new dropper, I'm just going to do a bit of jargon busting so that you know what we're talking about and the things that you need to consider along the way. Insertion depth is how far your dropper post can fit into your frame. So your dropper post's insertion depth is usually measured from the bottom of the collar down to the bottom of the mechanism on the dropper, and your frame will have an insertion depth hopefully written online. Otherwise you can get a tape measure and drop that inside the frame without a post obviously until it stops, and then the top of the collar will be how much insertion depth you can take in that frame. Now, annoyingly, there is different diameter sizes of posts and your frame will dictate a certain size, and there's a number of them. It could be 30.9, it could be a 31.6, there's a few out there, so do check your frame specs of what your seat post diameter is. If you don't know, maybe you have a post in there already. Often there is a measurement written on the post, so do check that before you start buying your new post. All dropper posts are going to need a lever to operate, and a lot of the modern ones will be internally routed cables, so you will need internal routing on your frame to accommodate that style. If you have a frame that doesn't have internal cable routing or any routing on the outside of the frame, you may be able to buy one with a lever that comes under the saddle. Now, you can get wireless dropper posts, you can even get hydraulically operated dropper posts, but most dropper posts are mechanical, which means that the lever that operates the action is using a gear cable. So a gear cable has a ferrule end, and the only thing you need to bear in mind when buying a new lever, because they are cross-compatible usually with different brands of dropper posts, is to make sure that you know which way round that gear cable goes. So some dropper posts have the ferrule end attached to the dropper, and some dropper posts require you to put the ferrule end through the lever and then route the cable round the dropper. So do check that on your new dropper and make sure that your lever is compatible with that. So we talked about the insertion depth, which is underneath the collar of the dropper right down to the bottom of the mechanism, so how far you can get the dropper in the frame. You will also see drop measured, which is how much the dropper moves by, so it could be 125 millimeters, for example. And then we talk about the overall stack height, which is from the bottom of the collar to the top of the seat clamp. So that's how much will be the minimum to stick out from your frame. Okay, let's get on with the 3 different ways that you might be choosing a dropper post. But bear in mind, the reason that I'm telling you all of this is to get that all-important pedal to saddle height correct. You will have a pedal to saddle height that is correct for you and your riding position, so not to injure yourself or give yourself a saddle height that's too high perhaps, and all of these measurements are taken into account that. So just bear that in mind when you listen to the next 3 options. If you have a rigid post in your bike and you want to swap to a dropper post, then measuring that is pretty simple. We just need to be interested in the measurement from the top of your frame to where the saddle clamps. And this will be your stack height. So you can look for a new dropper post that meets that stack height and doesn't go any higher. You can buy something smaller and just have the post sticking out like mine is. Or you're going to have to work out the drop that you need out of that stack height. So for example, if you have a post that sticks out, your rigid post, 150 millimeters, now dropper posts often have a collar that's around about 20 mil, and then they often have an extra bit above the drop, which is 10 mil. So usually there's about 30 mil in there. So if you have a rigid post that is 150 mil long, and that's what you want your stack height to be, then 150 minus 30 mils is 120. So 120 is the maximum drop in your post that you will be allowed. If you've got a dropper post already in your frame and you want to buy a new one or a different one, but you want to keep the same amount of drop, there is a couple of things to bear in mind. Not all collars are the same length across different brands of droppers. So do measure yours, see how much that collar is, and also measure the stack at the top of the drop. I'll need to measure that and make sure I take that into account when I buy my new dropper. Alternatively, you can work out what your overall stack height is and make sure when you buy your new dropper you're looking for that stack height to be matched or no bigger than, because otherwise your saddle is going to be a lot higher than you want it to be. If you've got a dropper post and you want a new dropper post that has more travel or a bigger drop, then you're still going to need to take into account those collar measurements if you're changing brands. And I always recommend looking at the overall stack so that your overall stack is never bigger and your saddle height will never end up too high. But also you need to bear in mind the insertion depth might actually increase on the post as well. So for example, here I've got 125mm drop on this, and it looks like I could get a bit more. Maybe I could move up to a 140. However, that 140 will have a longer post for that drop to go into because they're telescopic. And then that means it won't actually fit into my frame and it will stick out anyway. So I'll end up with a dropper post that is too long for me. So do just keep an eye on that stack and keep in those parameters of the maximum stack that you are allowed. Now, if you're on your way to a dream build and you're putting all the parts together, maybe you don't even physically have them yet, you can still work out what travel you need for your dropper post. Now, all you need to know is your pedal to saddle height. So mine is 790mm. And I always have 165mm cranks. So I need to deduct 165mm. And then you'll need to know your seat tube length, which should be on the website, perhaps in the geometry or sizing section of your new frame. So this one is 400mm. And then you'll also need to take into account a little bit of stack on your saddle. So mine is about 25mm up here. So you can measure it if you have it, or look on the website of your saddle. The manufacturers usually put this clamp from measurement to the top of the saddle. Now, once you've deducted those three things, you are left with this bit in the middle, which is your stack height. So when you start looking for your new dropper post, you can look for that stack height and make sure that you don't exceed that. Otherwise, you will have a saddle that is too high. Now, you can go lower because you can always bring your post out of the frame, but you don't want to go any higher. If you want to work out what drop you need, usually there's about 30mm going on a post here. So the collar's usually around about 10-20mm, and the stack from the drop measurement to the top of the clamp of the saddle, that's usually about 10mm as well. So you need to work out what that is on your new dropper and deduct that as well, and the remaining number is how much drop you will have. Now, obviously, you can go for the maximum, but just bear in mind that insertion depth, because if you get some longer drops, then it means you'll have a longer insertion depth as well, and just make sure that that is no bigger than the insertion depth that is allowed in your frame. If you've run through one of these calculation methods to come up with a drop for you and you think, oh, it's not quite enough, or you want to finesse it a little bit and get yourself maximum drop, there's a couple of things that you can alter. So bear in mind, if you're between a travel length, say you're wanting a 160 drop and you're finding 150s and 180s and no 160s, but you want that maximum drop, then you can look out for brands that are adjustable. They might have shims, shimmable different travel lengths. So someone like One Up, for example, you can change dropper posts by 10 or 20 mil sometimes. So if you wanted that 160 and they only sold a 150 or a 180, you could get the bigger 180 and shim it down by 20 mils, which would give you that 160. However, do bear in mind that because it originally started as a longer travel post, it will come with a longer insertion depth. So do check that number as well. Now, if you're finding that you're maybe 5 or 10 mil out and there's no way of trying to adjust that by finding a different brand or a different travel length, you may even be able to change your crank length. So obviously you're trying to get a pedal to saddle height to remain the same. But if there's 5 mil of difference, but you really want that maximum drop, can you bring your cranks in? Can you change them from, say, 170 to 165 to bring that saddle height or that saddle to pedal height correct, but then give yourself even more drop on the dropper post? Anyway, hopefully those 3 calculations and those extra tips will help you get an absolutely perfect fit on your dropper. Now, if you have any more questions, do let me know down in the comments below and use hashtag AskGMBNTech, where we can have a more in-depth answer on a Monday show. And if you want any help fitting your new dropper post, we have done a couple of videos on hydraulics and the mechanical droppers, so do check those out as well. But for now, happy shopping.